everyone, and welcome to Incorruptible Mass. Our mission here is to help you transform state politics. We know that together we can make Massachusetts policy reflect the needs of the vast majority of the residents of our beautiful state. And today we are going to talk about the new tax package. It includes both things like increasing the child tax credit, as well as stuff for rich people like lowering the estate tax and the capital gains taxes. We will talk about why we don't even need to be doing this and many of the other things that frustrate us about this entire process, the media, and all such other stuff. But before we do, let me introduce my quintabulous co-host. I don't think that's a word, but why not? I will start with Jordan Berg-Powers.
My name is Jordan Berg-Powers. I use he, him, and I have 10 plus years working in Massachusetts politics.
Jonathan Cohn.
Yeah, Jonathan Cohn, he, him, his, and here in Boston. I've been working on different issue and electoral campaigns here in Massachusetts for getting close to 10 years.
Anna Callahan, been doing a little kind of local and we'll say local politics stuff for 7-8 years now, but also here in Massachusetts state politics for a few years. Today we're talking taxes. Everybody loves taxes. So we're first of all, just want you guys to know that there is a tax package floating around. The House and Senate have been working on a tax package. Maura Healey, in her new term as governor, her first term as governor, is working on a tax package. And there are a lot of things being bandied about. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's a child tax credit. There is reducing capital gains taxes. There is reducing the estate tax. There's a lot of talk about different things. And we want to ground this conversation a little bit just by talking about the fact that in Massachusetts, which is not Taxachusetts, maybe we'll call this episode Taxachusetts, we really burden the lower income and middle income people with the vast majority of the taxes. We do not tax the wealthy. And in part, that's because of the Constitution of the state of Massachusetts that actually mandates that we cannot have what's called a progressive income tax, which has higher rates on people who are paid more and lower rates on people who are paid less. That is a very normal thing. That's how your national taxes are done. That's how most state taxes are done. But here in Massachusetts, we are not allowed to do that. And so it's a regressive, by its nature, it's a regressive tax system. And given that basic background, I am going to go ahead and just turn to Jordan for a little bit of a discussion of what do we have to have this kind of tax cut package?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of talk in the media right now, and it's certainly Governor Healey ran on the idea that we needed to cut taxes. And I just think it's important to note that we don't have to do this. There's no reason that we in Massachusetts need to cut taxes, especially after we just raised taxes on millionaires, on people who make $1 million or more, who people, and again, not on on the millionth and first dollar, we asked them to pay a little bit more. We agreed to that as a state to invest it in our people, to invest it in getting around easier, to invest it in our public education, to make sure that kids get the education they need so that classrooms aren't built in the 1800s, which the classrooms that my child goes to here in Worcester are. We are supposed to be investing it in that. We do not need to cut taxes right now, and we certainly don't need to cut taxes on rich people. It's bewildering the way in which both Maura Healey decided to run on it, the fact that she's doing it before doing basically anything else, no other major piece of legislation before she does that, as the first major thing she wants to do. And it's bewildering that the media continues to hype this up as something that needs to happen. It is not something that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to happen now. And it certainly isn't something that has to happen. We could be doing lots of other things right now with the money that Massachusetts has.
And speaking of the money that Massachusetts has, part of the talk is there is this, $3 billion of money unspent by the state government. A lot of it, is that ARPA money came in during COVID for relief. When there's, Jonathan, I want you to talk about this law that was passed in 1986 and how that affects what the tax package is that has happened.
Yeah. So one thing that ended up coming up last year, so like last summer when there was first talk about doing some type of tax package, it was in the midst of the fact that that there was a surplus and for the budget, which of course is like a temporary thing. So the idea of doing permanent tax cuts in response to a temporary surplus is bad math to begin with, as well as bad planning.
Yep.
So that they were kind of on track to be passing kind of something last summer. And then what entered the picture, what's often referred to as the tax cap law that was passed in 1986 on the ballot during the wave of like anti-tax kind of conservative sentiment in the 1980s. I'd like to point out whenever people talk about the 1986 law that a number of voters of today were not yet living in Massachusetts or born yet in 1986.
Or able to vote.
Or able to vote yet. I fall under the category of not being born yet for like for a couple years after that. So it's not something that needs to be treated as somehow sacrosanct. But what the 1986 tax cap law had said is that if the growth of the state revenue intake is larger than the growth of wages and salaries, that the state has to somehow just give the money back. That the state can't. That becomes like an artificially imposed constraint on what the state is able to do, and especially as something that is problematic given the way that wages and salary income as well as capital income like dividends or other things have trended over time, so that a lot of what's called, let's say, capital income, the money that you make by doing absolutely nothing productive for the most part, has risen very fast. Whereas salary and wage growth over the past 3 decades haven't. So it's created this like almost like ticking time bomb within the general, let's say, like financialization, as it's sometimes called, of the economy, makes that more likely to hit. So that had triggered last summer, and that led to the legislature scrambling to decide what to do anything about the fact that $3 billion was just going to be like gone from them. And then Charlie Baker decided he was just going to cut people checks, which is both like a very regressive thing to do because he rebated it to people in proportion to how much they paid in taxes to begin with, meaning that if you have $10 million, you just got like a really nice check in the mail. And if you made so little money that you didn't probably owe anything in taxes, like you didn't benefit from that when you're actually the person who could use additional money.
And who would put that money into would purchase things, would put that money into the market rather than just saving it and squirreling it off somewhere. Exactly.
And the thing that's wild with continuing with this now is we don't have, like, the state just lost $3 billion of money by just giving it back to people. So all of the discussion happening last summer around, oh, we have a surplus and we need to give it away, is gone. But it's continuing on like a zombie basis of this idea that we need to cut taxes. Despite the fact that it's not like we're necessarily flush. There's been talk about another recession possibly looming. The federal government is retrenching from a number of COVID-era programs.
Yep.
And rather than talking about how to make sure that we have a continued kind of recovery, Massachusetts is spending time to talk about how to cut its ability to do things. But I know Jordan wanted to talk.
Yeah,
about.
I just want to say that I think the reason why there's this connection between the 1986 law or 62F and the need to cut taxes is that fundamentally the media does not understand the law, is not taking the time to understand it, is instead parroting really wrong information about the law and how it got triggered, and using that to push its belief, because most of the people in the media are people who make above the median income. In at least the people who are pushing this, the sort of owners of it, certainly the owners of the Boston Globe, the owners of Gannett, right? Some of the people who own these businesses, not the journalists themselves, who are obviously underpaid. But a lot of the ways in which these things are getting pushed are being pushed by people who will benefit from it while not understanding it. So the ways that it got actually triggered is that Baker basically purposefully triggered it by artificially putting money into bank accounts that did not belong there, vis-a-vis the ARPA and the unemployment insurance, and pushing those things into those places, and inflation, right? Large spikes in inflation caused the 62F to get triggered. There is no reason that it got triggered. It's not triggered because of the base understanding of the law. Certainly the people who wrote the law in 1986 wouldn't think that this is the way it get triggered, even as it is a bad law. Baker purposefully manufactured its triggering and then illegally dispensed money to people rather than a tax rebate, as specifically stated in the law he cited. So he did his own thing and faced no consequences for doing his own thing. So I think it's important because this is the sort of soup we're swimming in vis-a-vis this law, and the media's consistent. Like, well, look, we had this money. We didn't have the money. We had ARPA money, and we had an artificial inflation of this thing to trigger it for the purposes of a tax rebate to people who ultimately are the benefactors of Charlie Baker, rich people.
Whew. Well, let's turn for a second to the estate tax in particular, right? There's a lot of talk about, and I will admit that I find this talk to be a little perplexing when, Maura Healey and others are talking about making our state more competitive because it's so unaffordable, and thus we're going to reduce the estate tax. And it doesn't really add up to me. But Jordan, I loved the way that you talked about it a few minutes ago about how totally absurd it is to even think something like that.
So in the hearing on this estate tax, and those for those who don't know, an estate tax is something you pay when you die, but you don't pay it. So to be clear, because you're gone, unfortunately, you are no longer here. You're not paying taxes. That's not how taxes work. You don't pay it for people. It's paid by the people who are left, the people who did not work for it, did not own it, had nothing before, and might get something, and now they may pay this small tax. It is a tiny.
They may get less, right? Rather than they're not going to get it and then pay a tax, right? They're going to get a little bit less. Yeah.
Roughly speaking, I mean, they probably get it. There's some things that move around with lawyers and stuff. And so one of the people who testified bewilderingly on behalf of this said that her friends were moving Massachusetts to New Hampshire and Florida to avoid the estate tax. You paid a tax. You sold your home. You still paid a tax. No sense. It's the most. It was illogical. It was absolutely illogical. I could not. I was losing my mind. It was totally illogical. This is the thing. They're like, most people, if they are going to trigger an estate tax, is because their house has artificially appreciated in cost. Let's just put it in regular terms. Your house is now worth more than $1 million. If you sell that house because you're worried that when you die, your ancestors will pay a tax, you may be one of the dumbest people on earth because you've just paid a tax to sell it. It just doesn't, like, that's the logic that Maura Healey brought to the state as a reason we should cut the state tax. That's the person who testified next to Maura Healey as the reason. It's illogical.
I want to tag in, though. The woman said that she might not even hit the threshold. It was just afraid that she was getting close to it.
Right, that's right. That's right. Because also
that's somehow even worse.
It's even worse. It's just so ridiculous. Estate taxes are not paid by people who are living. You will not pay it. If you own a home, you're paying taxes. You're paying a property tax.
Yep.
You might pay a sales tax if you decide to get warm weather and move to Florida, which is the reason people move to Florida, not because of taxation. Places you're paying a tax, right? Like, you're not, it's mind-numbing how undetached, because the way people talk about it, they talk about it like people alive are going to pay it.
Yeah.
That's not how it works. That's not how estate tax works.
What's so wild to me about that is how one thing that actually addresses what they're talking about is the discussion of what's called the senior circuit breaker, which is a way of trying to mitigate the cost of property tax to low and middle income seniors, because they might be asset rich and cash poor if their house is appreciated a lot in value. Like, that's targeted at those people. The estate tax, they're not paying the estate tax when they're alive. That, like, you as the person who is like who is asset rich and cash poor, the estate tax doesn't matter to you because you're not like that. It's not taking away that low amount of cash. It's just dealing with what gets resolved when you die.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I think it's important.
Yeah.
I just want to say really quickly that the estate tax, so a lot of they use these terms tax competitiveness, and it's nonsense. But just to be clear, other states, Oregon has an estate tax for $1 million, and that's 10 to 16%. Ours is much lower than that. It starts at 0.8%. It is a tiny portion. In other states, red states, Nebraska, Iowa, Kentucky, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, they have inheritance taxes, which means not just like all the things that you own are now valued more than $1 million. They pay a tax if you pass down anything worth of value, you're paying a tax. So some of these Republican states have a more aggressive taxation of this sort of transfer, again, that you will never see because unfortunately, you are no longer with us. And while that is sad, you are not paying taxes anymore.
That's right.
And I just want to, just so people kind of fully understand with the estate tax, so what Governor Healy wants to do, which is, and I will note, more aggressive than what Charlie Baker had tried to do last year, is wants to lift the estate tax threshold from $1 million where it stands to $3 million.
Yeah.
And does that in a way that gives the largest benefits to bigger estates, because the legislators have talked about addressing what's called like a cliff effect. It is a narrower thing that if you make slightly more than, if your estate is slightly more than $1 million, the net value of that estate could end up less than an estate just below, because the tax hits full value of the estate once you pass that. If you want to do a narrower fix, because cliffs are just not good policy design, you can do that narrowly around $1 million. Which I know, like Senator Pat Jelen has the ability to do that, to say like, we'll make sure that you never, like, by having more end up with less than somebody else who started off with less. That's something, doing something like that is fine. But since she wants to just make the exemption threshold, so the amount at which you're not paying, much higher, that again is helping all of those kind of, like, $2.5, $3 million state is not a small state, helps them, but also gives a tax benefit to larger estates, because her plan would give a tax benefit of $182,000, like to all of us, basically say we're going to give your estate like a tax benefit of $182,000 if you would still be paying this to fix a cliff at the new $3 million mark. But then that goes to everybody.
Yeah.
So that $5 million state, you get $182,000. $6 million, you get $182,000 back. $10 million, you get $182,000 back. If you don't pay a state tax in the first place, your estate's not getting that $182,000 credit because you're not paying it.
Yeah.
Which is jarring when you kind of compare the fairness of that, of giving that much to those with that much, when suddenly the extra $50 from the renter's deduction doesn't seem like quite a lot of money, or even that might get you like a nice meal out, or the $600 for a child tax credit, which I'm sure people could use, but they'd also much more value getting like a better, more robust childcare system, where you could put the money into and actually have build out the programming, as I thought was said well by House Freeman from the SAIU when he was testifying, is that there's no tax credit that's as progressive as actually just investing in new programs.
Oh my gosh. I mean, imagine the difference between $500 and having your kid go to pre-K. I mean, it costs like $15,000 to pay for if you're working, or exactly. One of you, and we know which one. It's always going to be the mother is going to stay home and put her career on hold. I mean, this is just systemic intersectional problems that affect each other, and this is all this tax stuff is taking money out of where we would get the resources to provide these programs. So this $500 tax, child tax credit, which sounds so like, oh, I got $500 in the mail, like whoop-de-doo. like those kinds of things prevent us, and this whole tax package prevents us from being able to provide real services to people.
Yeah.
And the one other thing I just wanted to quickly tag in is when just talking about the estate tax is how jarring it is, as well as we were just talking now about how much better uses that money for is, and how narrow the population who've been paying estate tax to begin with is that more people probably die in debt than paying estate tax, than have estates like valued that high. And so it feels very warped when the center of our attention is how do we help the people with estates over $3 million, rather than how do we address the fact that people are dying in debt because of medical bills.
Yeah. And I think that's important because I think people don't really understand this, that like when you pass, your estate pays those medical bills. So if you're worried, if you're like, oh, I'm going to use my house to pay for the, for whatever needs arise from my death, because those are also skyrocketing costs, your estate pays it and does not pay a tax. It only pays a tax after it disperses all of those medical bills, right? After it dispenses the cost of your funeral, the cost of all of those things, which are, unfortunate and skyrocketing and probably, worth their own like conversation. Once they disperse all of that, what's left has to be worth more than $1 million. You're not going to qualify for that if you're listening to this. Like, it's just not going to affect you. And if it does affect you, congratulations. Your ancestors who are left can pay a tiny fraction of that to help other people.
If you would pay that, you should donate to the podcast. And Anna, can you tell people how?
What a segue. Oh, if you think that this information should get into more people's ears, you can donate to the podcast. That would be amazing. We will have a link below. Anything is fabulous. If you got $5, you decide instead of your cup of coffee, you're going to, fund the podcast, that'd be great. If you happen to have an extra, a $3 million estate that you feel like giving over to the podcast, you're welcome to do that as well. We might as well throw that in there, right? And the other thing that you can do really is to take this episode, forward it to your friends, forward it to your your sort of progressive activist friends that you go to protests with, that you go to actions with, that you're in different conversations with about how to get this policy or that policy passed. We know there's like 10,000 people out there that we think would really benefit from hearing the podcast, really enjoy hearing the podcast, would think that you were super smart because you introduced them to the podcast. They would totally appreciate it. We are also starting to do a little bit of news. So we're expanding our efforts. And on that note, I am going to return to one thing that was said about like your ancestors will blah, blah, blah. But Jonathan, you had a really interesting thing to say about the estate tax and how, in Massachusetts, more than almost any other state, there are people whose ancestors have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years, accumulating wealth from all sorts of things in our past that we no longer think is even moral.
Exactly. So like one thing that's jarring when I think like Governor Healy, for instance, was talking about how Massachusetts is an outlier on the estate tax, which as Jordan noted, isn't it really even true to begin with. But we do have so much kind of multi-generational wealth in Massachusetts. Just because if you think about the fact of the people whose like whatever number back grandparents came over on the Mayflower, and that the role that Massachusetts played as a large financer of the growth of the United States, of the growth of industry, of the growth of commerce, of trade. There's an excellent book that came out recently called Brahmin Capitalism that looks at how Massachusetts financed Massachusetts financial elites financed the westward expansion of the United States after the Civil War, when their investments had been in the cotton industry. And when they were looking for new markets, and so much of that then builds up wealth upon wealth upon wealth, which is why beyond just we have like the kind of supply and demand issues that push up housing prices, but also some of them are like you just have a lot of massive houses that people can only afford, that are able to afford because they're inherited over generations, or the money that they have over generations that then leads to people's occupations over generations. And that's something that will be much more stark in Massachusetts than it will be in a number of other states. And because of that, and especially how that will play out when it comes to, say, like racial wealth gaps. As well, if you think about when the Massachusetts financial elite were financing the cotton industry, a lot like that, like who wasn't able to build wealth at that time were the enslaved kind of workers of the cotton industry, the slaves who were still kind of living in the deep south, or maybe just recently having been able to escape. And so that there's a fundamental disparity that still lives with us that we need to correct.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things that was really important during the hearing was, again, the Harris Group pointed out that the estate tax is the only tax that we have to right the wrongs of racial inequality. And in fact, this, just to put a number on it, the average wealth of a Black Bostonian is $8. So this is one way to point that back, and again, a tiny way, an extraordinarily tiny way to right a little bit of that wrong, right? And to say that we need to cut that is just an atrocious. It is really a backsliding on racial equity, while still claiming the importance of racial equity. It is borrowing my Blackness, borrowing the fact that I come from enslaved people, and then at the same time hurting that, making it worse on purpose, knowing that you're making it worse. And that is really, really troubling, to say the least.
100%. I'm going to turn us for a minute to tech capital gains, just because, I always get pretty irritated when the idea of what we should make sure not to tax people on is money that they have not earned, money that they only have because they have money. And to me, just the basic idea of like, how can you make an argument that we need to tax them less, we need to return more of this money that they literally did nothing for. Nothing that they did like created something in the world that people appreciated and spend money on for them to receive that money. Like it's so that to me is like super galling whenever that appears anywhere. Before we go on, comments on that, because it really gets me.
I want to let's talk about what capital means. Right, like that can be a tough term that can be hard to understand. So if you have an investment because you were able to get old and put some money aside and retire, you pay long-term, you pay what's called long-term capital gains, but that just means you pay one tax rate that says like, congratulations, you're retiring, here's a little something back because you weren't paying taxes on it the whole time. Here's a little something back to the state. You get to keep that money. Congratulations on retiring, good luck. That's one thing. This is what Maura Healey wants to lower is short-term capital gains, which mean these are people who are speculators. These are people who day in and day out are using money that they've inherited, money that they they didn't really earn. They're not doing anything. They're not working with their hands. They're not creating new ideas. They're not they're not doing anything productive to sort of forward humanity. They're just making money on their money. You have to pay higher taxes on that. There's lots of good reasons for that. One is, speculation. We don't want people just playing around, but honestly, they're not really thinking about the tax rate on it because they're trading so quickly. They're often not thinking about that short-term capital gains. And as Peter Enrich, who is an expert on this, who actually helped write this law, rightly points out, every study about this says that most people are making complex deals. If they are wheeling and dealing in Wall Street, they're making minute, complex deals. They're not looking at a tax rate while they're doing that. Right? They're not trying to figure out, oh, can I move money here? No. They're trying to make quick, minute deals to end that moment in short-term capital gains. They get money and they're taking that money out, right? And we're not doing on every trade deal. When they take money out for themselves, they're going to have to pay a higher tax than you or I who are working every day. Because the majority of the people who pay those short-term capital gains are overwhelmingly the top 1%. 80% of those taxes are paid by people in the top 1%. These are not people who need a tax break. And in fact, these are people who we just recently said we should tax more. And so what it does is, there's a really good graph out about this, which just really to simplify it for folks, The 12% is currently what they pay for short-term capital gains, which is mostly paid by people who are making over $1 million a year. If we lowered it to the 5%, which is what is being proposed by Governor Healy, that then takes that 12% and the 4% that they're going to pay, it's only about 9% that's way below what we've just said that they should be paying through the Fair Share Amendment, right? So Jonathan will talk more about that, but I just think it's really important to note that this is a tax that is not paid when you retire. When they're always like, oh, well, what if you work hard, you retire? You're not paying this tax. Yeah. This isn't for you. We have a tax set aside. And if you want to make it easier for people who are retiring to take out that money, target it at older folks who are doing that. Target it. We actually do make exemptions for low income people who are taking money out for retirement. If they don't hit a threshold, they don't pay any tax on that. We do have that threshold. So there are things that we have done to recognize that that's something we want, is for older folks to retire and be able to live on that. That's not what this tax is. And so we should be proud that we're not the most. California taxes this at the most. It taxes at 13%. We should be ashamed we're not there.
Yeah.
Instead of the goal to say that we should be competitive with states that don't trade every day, that are in our wealth, that don't have the things we have. We're not competitive. We are below other states that we should be competing with. New Jersey's at 10.75%. DC is at 10.75%, right? We should be, and that's all the capital gains total, right? Like, we should be up with them. We should be with California. We should be with these people, competing with them, because that's our peers. And that's who should, and that's the least we should do, frankly, again, because this is not money that's being made by doing real work. We should be taxing it more.
Absolutely.
We should be taxing it more, because we are at one of the most unequal times in society, and regular people are being asked to pay a lot for our society, and we should be asking these people to be paying more for our society.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned the Fair Share Amendment, which of course was just passed. Jonathan, for your Organization for Progressive Mass, worked so hard on that for so many years with the Raise Up Coalition. And can you talk a little bit about how, like, this is kind of a slap in the face of all the voters who voted for this Fair Share Amendment?
Exactly. It's one thing that I was thinking about the other day when watching the hearing, is that legislators constantly, when we say we want to invest more in public schools, we'll say, well, where's the money to do that? Like, we don't have the money. If we say we want to invest more in public higher education, they'll say, where's the money? If we ask about fixing the T, they'll say, where's the money? If about like fixing roads or structurally deficient bridges, that's always the response. So we went out and got them the money. We just had kind of a long time coming kind of ballot initiative that was finally successful, of being able to raise like a surtax on income over $1 million to create dedicated funding in the state budget for education and transportation. And the first response out of our governor is, how do I give that money back? And that's just a slap in the face that, like, all of the people who worked on that campaign, because now politicians like to pretend that there's like somehow tax money is this one bucket, and like the expenditures are this bucket, and somehow they're not the same pocket of money. And so, despite the fact that we as a state can't print money, so you basically spend what you take in. If you are cutting $1 million, like if you're cutting $1 billion out of the budget through tax cuts, the $1 billion of spending that you're touting about fair share is not additive money. You're cutting something to make room for that. At the end of the day, you are moving money around in the same way that people accused you of that said cynically that legislators would do. And that leads to something that we have cuts to, like, rental assistance as the federal government retrenches. That gets cut out of the budget. Those regressive tax cuts, which were about $400 out of the $1 billion package, are basically the reason for any other cuts in the budget to necessary programs. And it's always kind of just jarring to me how legislators don't understand the basic math, that those are
so basic. Money comes in to a pot of money that has a size, and then when you spend it, it goes out. And when you do tax cuts, there's less money.
Yeah.
How hard can it be? Jordan, I want to have you jump in a little bit. So you were mentioning something earlier that I had not heard of, H-dip. So tell us, bring us in.
Yeah. So I want to talk about H-dip in a second. I just want to also add to what Jonathan said about the money being spent out is that there's not this all comes at a cost, and they're making it sound like there isn't, like they're like this is just, oh, it's just free money we're going to spend. But when the money from ARPA goes away, these tax cuts stay. When there's another recession, these tax cuts stay. And when we need that revenue to get out of the problems we have, when we need this revenue because things are blowing down, that money is gone. Even and they're spending ARPA money, they're spending federal dollars that are here one time. So they all talk about this like this is this permanent thing that we're going to have, but that's because it's bloated with federal money. When that federal money disappears, again, as Jonathan said, right, like that's gone, and it's mind blowing. It's mind blowing what they're talking. So
financially irresponsible.
And so, the H-dip program. H-dip is a program. Let me get the name for it. It's the Housing Development Incentive Program, and as the state website says, provides a gateway cities with a tool to develop market rate housing while increasing residential growth and expanding diversity of housing stock. It's a local option. It's basically free taxes. This is the part that's the most galling to me. You can spend no less than 10% and no more than 100% on market rate residential housing. It means that you must spend the money on unaffordable housing. Because when they say market rate, they don't mean like what you can afford. They don't mean based on your median income. They mean what does it cost currently out in the world for housing? You know, the things that you can't afford. That's what it's currently doing. And so, for example, you would have to make roughly about $110,000 in Malden to afford a 3-bedroom apartment. So if you were a single mom with 2 kids, you need $110,000 to afford market rate. I just want to let that sink in for a second. That's a bonker. That is a tool. H-dip is terrible housing policy. And so Maura Healey is proposing cutting rental insurance and increasing rent in the poorest parts of the state, increasing tax dollar incentive to increase rent where you live. Think about that. And they were all praising it. No one stood up and said, H-dip's actually a terrible program. It's a terrible program. If we need more housing, which we do, and we need more housing in gateway cities, which we do, and we need more multi-unit in gateway cities, which we do, then fund that. Give a tax cut for affordable housing, for housing based on the median income in the zip code or the median income for the city. Make it actually set to some real life things that people are doing. Make it real. Market rate housing is another term for gentrification.
Yeah.
So what Maura Healey is wanting to do is to increase gentrification in gateway cities, right? The lowest amount if you wanted to live in the lowest rent in Massachusetts, right? Like you wanted to move someplace in Massachusetts with the lowest rent, you would need to make $23 an hour to afford a 3-bedroom, $23 an hour. And most of those places are places that could qualify for this tax incentive, which would again fast track gentrification in these places. This is really bad policy. I'm very thankful for City Councilor Attell in Worcester for raising this at the hearing. I was really disappointed that people consistently talked about it as a good thing. And I think the underlying reason that people talk about H-dip as good policy is fundamentally racism. They're just like, look, no, who would want to build with the blacks and the browns and the poors? Let's give the developers free money. That's the only way we'll give the poor something that they need, some roofs over their head, right? Like that's the underpinning assumptions. The underpinning assumptions are people who don't live in these neighborhoods, who aren't forced to pay paycheck to paycheck for rents, who don't really care There's like, look, let the poorest have some. Let's give. I mean, look, who would you want to be near these poorest and these blacks? I mean, you don't want to develop near them. We got to give them somebody to do it. People will develop in Worcester. They don't need free money to develop in Worcester. There's going to be plenty of market rate housing in Worcester. There's going to be plenty of market rate housing. What we need is targeted money towards the things we actually want, right? And we need money to invest in public transportation to make more places in our gateway cities attractive to developers. You want to make something attractive to developers, put an easily accessible mass transit near it. Prices go up real quick, right? Yeah. Make it easy to get there, make it easy to get around, and that takes money. It doesn't take tax cuts for rich people, especially ones that won't appreciate it because they're already passed on.
Ooh, my goodness. Well, obviously we're super happy with the tax package. We love all parts of it. We think it's amazing. Thanks everybody. Thanks for listening. We always love being here with you, and we look forward to seeing everyone on the streets, and we look forward to chatting with you all next week. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching us on YouTube. Please like and subscribe. And it would be amazing if you would also subscribe to us on your favorite podcast player. Just look for Incorruptible Massachusetts wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much.